Part 1. Understanding Love. Marriage, still a great idea. Chapter 1. Marriage is like a precious gem. A lot of people are confused about marriage these days. In the eyes of many, the institution of marriage has become irrelevant, an archaic relic of a simpler and more naive time. They question whether marriage is still a good idea, particularly in today's more liberated and enlightened culture. Concepts such as honor, trust, faithfulness, and commitment seem old-fashioned and out of touch with modern society. Many people change partners as easily as they change shoes, and almost as frequently. This confusion over marriage should not surprise us, considering the bewildering barrage of worldly attitudes and philosophies that hits us at every turn. Every day, books, magazines, movies, and television soap operas, sitcoms, and prime-time dramas bombard us with images of wives cheating on their husbands and husbands cheating on their wives. Unmarried men and women hop into bed with each other at the drop of a hat, and just as quickly hop out again to find their next partner. People today shop for relationships the way they shop for clothes. They try something on for size, and if it does not fit, they simply try something else. When they find something that suits them, they wear it for a while until it fades or goes out of style. Then they throw it out or hang it up in the back of their closet and rush out to replace it. We live in a disposable, cast-off and throwaway society that has largely lost any real sense of permanence. Ours is a world of expiration dates, limited shelf life, and planned obsolescence. Nothing is absolute. Truth exists only in the eye of the beholder, and morality is the whim of the moment. In such an environment, is it any wonder that people ask, "Doesn't anything last anymore? Isn't there something I can depend on?" One major symptom of a sick society is when we attach to our human relationships the same attitude of impersonal transience that we display toward the inanimate and disposable items that we use in everyday life. Marriage is the deepest and most intimate of all human relationships, yet even it is under assault. Is marriage still viable in modern society? Does it still make sense in our transitory world? Is marriage still a good idea? Marriage is God's idea. The answer is yes. Marriage is still a good idea because it is God's idea. He created it. He designed it. He established it and defined its parameters. Contrary to much contemporary thought and teaching, marriage is not a human concept. Mankind did not simply dream up marriage somewhere along the line as a convenient way of handling relationships and responsibilities between men and women, or dealing with childbearing and parenting issues. Marriage is of divine origin. God Himself instituted and ordained marriage at the very beginning of human history. The second chapter of Genesis describes how God, taking a rib from the side of the man He had already created, fashioned from it a woman to be a suitable helper, Genesis 2 verse 20, for the man. Then God brought the man and the woman together and confirmed their relationship as husband and wife, thereby ordaining the institution of marriage. From the outset, God established marriage as a permanent relationship, the union of two separate people, a man and a woman, into one flesh. When Adam first laid eyes on Eve, he exclaimed, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." Genesis 2, verse 23. God's design for marriage is found in the very next verse. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. Genesis 2, verse 24. One flesh is not simply the gluing of two people together, but rather the fusion of two distinct elements into one. If I glue two pieces of wood together, they are bonded, but not fused. They remain two separate pieces of wood, and sufficient heat or pressure will break the bond. In the world of chemistry, different elements are linked to each other by chemical bonds that allow them to work together in a particular manner. If that bond is broken, those elements are released and go their separate ways. It is different with fusion. When two elements are fused into one, they become inseparable. A force of sufficient magnitude may destroy them, but it can never disjoin them. A man and a woman who have become one flesh under God's design for marriage cannot be separated without suffering great damage or even destruction. It would be the spiritual equivalent of having an arm or a leg torn from their bodies. When God ordained that the man and the woman should become one flesh, He plainly had a permanent, lifelong relationship in mind. Jesus, the great Jewish rabbi and teacher, made this abundantly clear during a discussion with some Pharisees over the question of divorce. The Pharisees asked Jesus if it was lawful for a man to divorce his wife, pointing out that Moses had permitted it in the law. "It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law," Jesus replied. "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate." Mark 10, verses 5 to 9. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. If marriage were of human origin, then human beings would have the right to set it aside whenever they chose to do so. Since God is the one who instituted marriage, He alone has the authority to determine its standards and set its rules. He alone has the authority to do away with it. This He will not do, for the Scriptures are clear. Marriage is a God-ordained institution that involves the joining of a man and a woman as one flesh in a lifelong relationship. This institution will last as long as human life lasts on earth. Only in the life to come will marriage be dispensed with. Marriage is a foundational institution. Another important truth about marriage is that God established it as the first and most fundamental element of human society. While the family is the basic foundation of any healthy society, marriage is the foundation of the family. Marriage is a foundational institution that predates all other institutions. Before there were nations or governments, before there were churches, schools, or businesses, there was the family. And before the family, there was marriage. Marriage is foundational because it is on this relationship that God began to build society. When God brought Adam and Eve together in the garden, Marriage was the framework for the development of their social interaction as they grew together. It was in the context of marriage that they learned their responsibilities toward each other and lived out their commitments to each other. Human society in all its forms depends on marriage for its survival. That is why the current low regard for marriage in the minds of so many is so dangerous. With all traditional values and foundations being assaulted at every turn, is it any surprise that marriage is under attack as well? With so many people so confused about marriage, is it any wonder that society in general is in such disarray? The adversary's global attack on marriage is actually an attack on society itself, and ultimately an attack on God, the creator and manufacturer of society and marriage. The adversary knows that if he can destroy marriage, he can destroy families. If he can destroy families, he can destroy society. And if he can destroy society, he can destroy humanity. Marriage is also the foundation upon which the church, the community of believers, and God's special society rests. The New Testament describes the relationship between Christ and his church as being like that of a bridegroom to his bride. This analogy has significant implications for understanding how husbands and wives are to relate to each other. For example, in his letter to the church in Ephesus, the first-century Jewish apostle, Paul, wrote, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church." Ephesians 5, verses 21 to 23, verse 25, and verses 31 to 32. The relationship between Christ and his church is a model for that which should exist between husband and wife, a relationship of respect, mutual submission, and sacrificial love. From Genesis to Revelation, the Bible often uses the word house to refer to the smallest and most basic unit of society, the family. The house is the foundation of society, and marriage is the foundation of the house. The health of a marriage determines the health of a house, and the health of a nation's houses determines the health of the nation. Misconceptions of marriage. It is the same in the church. A church's health depends on the health of the houses of its members, particularly those in leadership. Good family management is a fundamental requirement for church leaders. Paul made this clear when he wrote to Timothy, "Here is a trustworthy saying. If anyone sets his heart on being an overseer, he desires a noble task." 1 Timothy 3, verse 1. Among other things, he must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him with proper respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? 1 Timothy 3, verses 4 to 5. A healthy house is the key to both a healthy church and a healthy society. The measure of a healthy house is a healthy marriage. Marriage is a foundational institution. Procreation is not the primary purpose of marriage. One misconception many people have, both inside and outside the church, is that the primary purpose of marriage is the propagation of the human race. The Bible indicates otherwise. Although in Genesis 1 verse 28, God issued the charge to man to be fruitful and multiply, and although he defined marriage as the parameters in which reproduction should take place, procreation is not the primary purpose of marriage. God's command had to do with creation and subduing the created order. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Genesis 1, verse 28. God created man, male and female, and he expected them to procreate and fill the earth with other humans, all of whom would rule over the created order as his vice-regents. Marriage was essentially a companionship covenant, the relational structure through which men and women, husbands and wives, would join and become one flesh and together rule the earthly dominion God had given them. Procreation is a function of marriage, but it is not the main focus. As contemporary society plainly shows, marriage is not necessary for procreation. Unmarried men and women have no trouble at all making babies. In many parts of the world, the number of out-of-wedlock births exceeds the number of babies born to married women. That is one reason why many scientists and sociologists are concerned that at the current rates, within 1 or 2 generations, the global population will grow beyond the Earth's capacity to sustain it. Contrary to the common idea that marriage is mainly about making babies, marriage actually serves as a deterrent to rampant reproduction. There are at least 2 reasons for this. First, the social and moral requirements of being married before having children is still very strong in many, many places. Most people are still sensitive to the respectability of marriage, and that respect holds back a lot of procreation that would otherwise take place. Were it not for the institution of marriage, human beings would be even more prolific than they already are. Second, married couples who take the responsibilities seriously are careful not to conceive and give birth to more children than they can adequately love and care for. Paul had some strong words on this subject. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. 1 Timothy 5, verse 8. There is nothing sinful or unbiblical about careful advanced family planning. Let me make it clear that abortion is not family planning, nor is it health care. Abortion is the termination of life and the premeditated destruction of potential. It is the death of destiny and the interference of divine protocol. Abortion is rebellion against the known will of God. On the contrary, true family planning is mature, responsible stewardship. Sex is not the primary purpose of marriage. Another common misunderstanding is that marriage exists for the purpose of legitimizing sexual relations. Marriage should never be equated with sex, because sex is not the primary purpose of marriage. Sexual union is not and never has been the same thing as marital union. Marriage is a union that implies and involves sexual union as the establishment of a blood covenant, a central obligation, and a pleasure. See 1 Corinthians 7, verses 3 to 5. But the 3 are not the same. First of all, marriage involves commitment. Sex has very little to do with commitment. It is a 100% physical response to physiological and biochemical stimuli. Sex is one expression of commitment in marriage, but it never creates commitment. By itself, sex neither makes nor breaks a marriage. Marriage is broader and deeper than sex and transcends it. Marriage is perhaps 1% sex, the rest is ordinary, everyday life. If you marry for sex, how are you going to handle the other 99%? For many years, it has been a common belief that adultery breaks a marriage. That is simply not true. Sex does not create a marriage, so how can it break a marriage? Adultery is sin, and, according to the Bible, the only legitimate grounds for divorce for a believer. Even then, it is not automatic. Divorce is not mandatory in such instances. Adultery does not break the marriage. Breaking the marriage is a choice. Recognizing that sexual union and marital union are not the same is absolutely essential to any proper understanding of marriage. It is also essential in understanding divorce and remarriage. Marriage is bigger than, distinct from, but inclusive of sexual union. Absence of sexual activity will never unmake a marriage, nor will its presence alone turn a relationship into a marriage. Marriage and sex are related, but they are not the same. A gem of a marriage. How then should we define marriage? If marriage is not primarily for sex or procreation, then what is it? As always, we can find the answer in the Bible. God's Word is truly amazing. Nothing we read there is there by accident. The basic Greek word for marry or marriage is gameo, which derives from the same root as our English word gem. That root word literally means to fuse together. Fusion of different elements into one describes the process by which precious gems are formed deep in the earth. That process is also an apt description of marriage. Precious gems such as diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and sapphires are formed far underground out of ordinary elements that are subjected to great heat and massive pressure over an extended period of time. Heat, pressure, and time working together can transform even the most common material into something extraordinary. Take coal, for example. Coal is formed when partially decomposed wood or other plant matter is combined with moisture in an airless environment under intense heat and pressure. This process does not happen overnight, but requires centuries. Although coal is basically a form of carbon, its constituent elements can still be distinguished under chemical analysis. Coal that remains in the earth long enough, thousands of years longer, under continuous heat and pressure, eventually is transformed into diamond. Chemically, diamond is pure carbon. The distinct elements used in its formation can no longer be identified. Pressure has fused them into one inseparable element. Heat gives diamond its luster. Marriage as God designed it is like a precious gem. First of all, it develops over time. Diamonds don't form in 10 years. They require millennia. It takes only a few minutes to get married, but building a marriage requires a lifetime. That's one reason why God established marriage as a permanent, lifelong relationship. There must be sufficient time for two people with separate and distinct backgrounds and personalities to become fused together as one flesh. Secondly, godly marriage becomes stronger under pressure. A diamond is the hardest substance on earth. Millions of tons of pressure over thousands of years fuse and transform carbonized matter into a crystal that can withstand any onslaught. A diamond can be cut only under certain conditions and using specially designed tools. In a similar way, external pressures temper and strengthen a godly marriage, driving a husband and wife closer together. Just as pressure purifies a diamond, so the everyday problems and challenges of life purify a godly marriage. A husband and wife face the pressure together. The harder things get, the stronger their union grows. Marriage fuses two different people into one, so that, under pressure, they become so hard and fast that nothing can break them. Godly marriages and worldly marriages respond differently to pressure. In the world, when the going gets tough, partners split up. Like those two pieces of wood glued together, they are bonded but not fused. The heat and pressure of life break them apart. That same heat and pressure fuse a godly couple together so that their marriage grows ever stronger until they become inseparable and unbreakable. Collision of histories. Marriage is never just the coming together of two people, but a collision of their histories. It is a clash of cultures, experiences, memories, and habits. Marriage is the beautiful accommodation of another lifetime. Building a strong marriage takes time, patience, and hard work. One of the hardest adjustments anyone faces is moving from single life to married life. Let's be honest, people do not change overnight. When you marry someone, you marry more than just a person. You marry an entire family, a complete history of experiences. That's why it is often so hard at first to understand this person who is now sharing your house and your bed. Both of you bring into your marriage 20 or 30 years of life experiences that color how you see and respond to the world. Most of the time, you quickly discover that you see many things quite differently from each other. Difference of viewpoint is one of the biggest sources of stress and conflict in young marriages. Adjusting to these differences is critical to marital survival. Unfortunately, many marriages fail on precisely this point. All of us filter what we see and hear through the lens of our own experiences. Personal tragedy, physical or sexual abuse, quality of family life when growing up, educational level, faith, or lack of faith. Any of these affect the way we view the world around us. They help shape our expectations of life and influence how we interpret what other people say or do to us. None of us enter marriage clean. To one degree or another, we each bring our own emotional, psychological, and spiritual baggage. Whatever our spouse says, we hear through the filter of our own history and experience. Our spouse hears everything we say the same way. Understanding and adjusting to this requires a lot of time and patience. Over time, and under the pressures of daily life, a husband and wife come to understand each other more and more. They begin to think alike, act alike, and even feel alike. They learn to sense each other's moods and often recognize what is wrong without even asking. Gradually, their personal attitudes and viewpoints shift and move toward each other so that their mentality is no longer yours and mine, but ours. This is when the gem-like quality of marriage shines most brilliantly. Fusion creates oneness. A godly marriage is like a precious gem in another way as well. Normally, we don't find gems simply by walking along looking on the surface of the ground as we would searching for seashells on the beach. To find gems, we have to dig deep into the earth and chisel through hard rock. In the same way, we will never obtain God's kind of marriage simply by going along with the crowd, doing what everybody else does. We have to dig deep into the heart of God to discover His principles. Precious gems are rare, and so is a genuine marriage. There are no shortcuts, no easy 1, 2, 3 formulas. We have only God's Word to instruct us, and His Spirit to give us understanding and discernment. But that is all we need. Rarely will we find anything of true value simply lying on top of the ground. The good stuff is most often found deep down where we have to work to get at it. A good marriage is something we have to work at. It doesn't happen by accident. Just as a precious diamond is the final result of a long and intensive process, so is marriage. So, what is marriage? Marriage is a God-ordained institution, a lifelong relationship between one man and one woman. Over time, and under the heat and pressure of life, two people under the covenant of marriage come together and are lost in each other to the point where it becomes impossible to tell where one leaves off and the other begins. Marriage is a process, a fusion of two distinct and different elements into one. A sparkling jewel of love, faithfulness, and commitment that shines brightly in a world of short-lived fads and impermanence. Principles. 1. Marriage is still a good idea because it is God's idea. 2. Marriage is a foundational institution that predates all other institutions. 3. Procreation is not the primary purpose of marriage. 4. Sex is not the primary purpose of marriage. 5. Marriage, as God designed it, is like a precious gem, a fusing of two different elements into one. 6. Godly marriage develops over time. 7. Godly marriage grows strong under pressure. 8. Godly marriage is a fusion that creates oneness.